Always the best thing to do when you're teaching. Lock the doors. Okay, well, welcome this evening. And it's my real pleasure as the leader of the PES theme to be able to introduce Aliya to you today. I mean, I'll introduce you to you. Almost certainly know her already, because it's actually been a year since she joined us as a lecturer in comparative and international education from the University of Cambridge, where she did her PhD, which is PhD in 2020, on Pakistani Mothers Agency, which was fascinating. But Aliya's also done quite a lot of work in the UK now on particular patterning of aspirations by ethnicity and by gender and intersections with social class and kind of areas that are really interesting in terms of overlap with what I do as well. So you've got a range of perspectives now internationally and from the UK. And I think what you're going to talk to us today is kind of about your personal take on some of these issues, giving us a bit of an overview of some of the work you've done, which is appropriate for a kind of inaugural lecture, really, which is kind of what this is in a way, isn't it? So I'll say no more than that, just to welcome you, and we're all very keen to hear what you have to say. So go about 35 minutes, I think.
Oh dear, I might just get carried away.
As long as you want, really, and then we can have some questions and answers, and then there will be nibbles and wine at the back. Okay, thank you.
So before we begin, can I just request someone to just observe a minute of silence? So there was an explosion in Peshawar, where I'm from, in a mosque where people were praying, and more than 24 people died. Many people were injured. Some are still under the rubble. So I thought it would be really nice to just pay our respects and with some silence for 1 minute. Thank you so much. Hi, David. Sorry, we were just observing a minute of silence. There's been an explosion in Peshawar, so I'm just paying our respects. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. It's evening, and I really appreciate you coming here, listening to this talk. When I was invited for this, I thought about what I wanted to say, and then I thought it's a good opportunity for me to kind of introduce to you the work that I do. But the more I thought about it, I realized that it's really hard for me to really talk about the kind of work I do. I don't do like large scale work, very specific, in-depth kind of studies. And I said it wouldn't be possible until, you knew more about what my journey has been, what has made me the way that I am today and the work that I do today. So then I started thinking about, how do I introduce myself? How do I talk about it? Because whatever we do, regardless of the fact that we are able to make those connections, it's all connected. We are being inspired by certain things, and that leads us to certain paths and the decisions that we take in our lives. Even the ones that we don't want to take, usually we mold them according to the things and experiences that we've had. There were two things that I thought were quite relevant. So one is Southernness, and the other is representation. And I thought these are really key concepts. And I just want to talk a little bit about what I will be meaning by South when I talk today. And I really draw on the kind of ideas that Boaventura Santos would actually call the South, which means, we know that this globalizing world, we've been trying to make sense of this rapidly diversifying and a world where there are so many knowledges that we can't make sense of, but we're interacting with different people in the world. So we've been trying to make sense of that difference. There is a difference, and I would argue it's really important to understand that difference and that concept of the other. Because if we erase this difference, then there's a risk that we might not be able to challenge, what the hierarchies are and how oppression can actually be dismantled. So lest we don't erase that, I think it is essentially important, just like many other scholars, to remember the element of difference. Now, we have to deal with this aspect of difference. And in order to sort of conceptualize, theorize, and wrap our heads around what difference we can actually describe as, we've used different vocabulary. So all of us know that very early on, derogatory terms like third world and first world countries were actually used, heavily critiqued. Then we came to developed countries and developing countries. That was also, debated. And then we have global North and South, which is still in use. And that is being used for the sake of, ease a lot of times, but people argue against that too. So Santos talks about this idea of the North and the South, not as a geographic descriptor, but rather, as a metaphor for marginalization. So what does that mean? That means in a country that has a stable economy, there will be populations and communities that are really, really struggling to even survive. That is the South within that North. And then you have countries that have very unstable economies, people are dying of hunger, and there you would have really, really rich people who own perhaps private planes and whatnot. So then what is important is for us to understand that the difference doesn't apply if we try to homogenize certain peoples and groups, to really understand, what are the complexities within that. So the South is thus, something that we should understand as, signaling marginalization. Now, this issue and this understanding of the South, I'll come back to what I mean by Southernness, is also very much related to representation. So in our attempts to try and understand the South, and we have been the South a lot of times in our lives too, we need to have the vocabulary or the sensibilities to then be able to present what we find and the knowledge that we get in ethically sensitive ways. And all of us try to be ethically sensitive. We worked really hard to do that. But sometimes there are broader kind of discourses that if we don't have any knowledge of, we kind of fall into their traps. So Gayatri Spivak talks about that process of otherization. So we recognize that there's a difference. It is because of whatever power asymmetries are there. We challenge that. And then with the South, when we present the South to the world, do we represent them in a particular deficit light? And that is where the politics of, the South, recognizing the South and trying to construct and conceptualize the South in ethical ways, and then the ways in which we or other people represent those peoples of the world. So these two things are really, really the key, or the way in which I have, developed in my, personally, and also myself as a researcher. Now, if I am standing here in front of you, and obviously you can see me, so I'm a brown woman from Pakistan, and I'm Muslim. I come from region in Pakistan that you just heard about, just lots of explosions there. We border Afghanistan. Even within Pakistan, that region is seen as more conservative. So when I say conservative, that potentially means, just like other parts of the world, conservatism is enacted through the bodies of women, right? Same is the case in that region, just like the rest of the world. So I come from that region, which is in Pakistan also seen as the South. And so when I told you all of those things, you would think that perhaps I am the South then. I would like to disagree slightly with that, a lot with that. Because while I was living in that region, I was the ethnic majority. I was an upper middle class, coming from an upper middle class family. I had much more resources than a lot of people around me. I have had the resources to get education abroad. I am now in much of a northern position than the rest of the people who get their PhDs, for example, from Pakistan. So I have been the North a lot of times very strongly too, right? Now, these are the tensions between that identity of the South, which I think is slightly explainable through some of the work that scholars like Lizzie Milligan and others do, where they talk about this fluidity of your own identity as a state of being in the in-between, the in-betweenness. And some of my work also, touches upon that idea as well. Okay. Apologies, it is, yeah. So when I arrived here and I did my research, and it was right after one of the most gruesome attacks on one of the schools in Peshawar, and I was very motivated. I had met some mothers, and my PhD was a motivation. That is what motivated my PhD as well. And when I arrived here, I met wonderful, intellectually, really brilliant people, and they could speak to me and talk about the issues that I was facing. And I was surprised. They knew a lot. And of course, what they knew was correct. But what I didn't understand was why that discomfort was there. So although everything that they said was right, and I completely agreed with that, but there was some kind of a discomfort, and I couldn't understand what this discomfort was. And soon I realized that as a person and a person who had been the South, gone through certain situations that a lot of us do, to different scales and degrees, you tend to then sort of move in that situation, and you tend to do things. You survive, you prevail. A lot of things happen then. That gives you an immense sense of pride. And so when I talked about issues, what I saw was reflected back at me, an idea of myself that wasn't the way that I felt about myself. You know what I mean? So in a sense, I was the South, but that South was something else. It was a pride. It was something that I was, I felt powerful. But yet what was reflected back at me was completely different. And that's when I realized this tension in politics between, you experiencing the South and then you being represented, and that representation, mirroring back at you is what the tension actually is. And this is what I term as Southernness, that experience of being in that space where you are in the in-betweenness, and at the same time, you're struggling here and there. And you would have people having different sorts of struggles. And it's not a hierarchy, but understanding, contextualizing historically, and also in the present situation with the power hierarchies in the world, understanding the context of where we are. So that is how my work actually, my identity came as a result of this. So I'm going to quickly go through some of the work that I'm really, really proud of. And I think it ties very strongly with the kind of work that I do. I will go quickly through some of the projects. One I'm going to talk a little bit more about because it is very recent, and it talks about some of the issues that I've seen very recently. I've done field work. But if you have any further questions, I'm always very happy to sort of take them later. So my PhD is what made me understand what is meant by Southern epistemologies and methodologies. And what I mean by that is that there was a lot that was happening. So I went into Pakistan, certain villages of Pakistan. I met mothers, and I looked at how they shaped their children's or daughters' education in Pakistan. And these were very under-resourced communities as well. The literature that I had was all telling me that, the mothers who are more educated, perhaps, their daughters and children do well and all that. Now here I land in the field, and I realized that the mothers who are engaged in these, fantastic, amazing, mind-boggling strategies to do certain things in their lives have never set foot in a school, basically. So I had what Miranda Fricker would call an epistemic revolution. I was shaken completely. I had no resources or research experience to help me make sense of what I was seeing. Now, when I met these mothers, I saw, you could see that glimmer in the eye, there was so much power in the way that they were telling me things. But if you analyze their situation from the lens of, let's say, social justice or liberal feminism, you would say these are extremely oppressed women living in these low-resourced communities, actually not able to do anything. Now, that wasn't going completely against my instinct because I was there, I was listening to them, and they were doing really complex, interesting things, but I just didn't know how to make sense of those things. So that led me to then explore other ways of understanding and making sense of things that happen that may just, supersede our own abilities, or at least my knowledge and my resources. And for me, that is Southern epistemologies and methodologies. That is the act of deconstructing what you actually know and engaging in, the world with an open mind and trying to learn and really understand what's happening. Now, what that means is there's a lot of work to do because things are not laid out, clearly for us, and we might not find the instruments. It's sometimes, a lot of times it is, but sometimes not even that aspect of, something being malicious, but actually just things not being quite primitive. If I may say, I believe that the research hearing, especially related to issues of the South, are quite primitive in their hearing sensibilities as researchers. So we need to develop more. We need to learn more and understand more. So I came back and I thought, how do I write about it? What do I see? And there was a dilemma because I remember I used to go to bed and I would have cold sweats thinking, how am I going to talk about these women? What am I going to say about these women, right? And, will that do justice? Like, it was a huge responsibility. So I came across on that side, you have one of my papers, which is, I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but it's an extension to the capability approach if somebody has any background in it. But the capability approach is a framework for social justice, and it talks about giving people equal opportunities of freedom to choose the things that they would want in life. Now, what is potentially wrong with the framework is that it constructs its ideas on the importance of freedom. Now, this framework, what it does is that it talks about that context where there are unfreedoms. Historically, people have not had the rights. But that also means that they've lived in these contexts and situations. Obviously, those rights need to be given to those people, but there are people living in those conditions. And those people are actually doing things, so they're not objects. So it kind of, in this work, I have tried to conceptualize with my supervisor and understand, how do you construct social justice framework in which you acknowledge that there are contexts where there are unfreedoms as a default position. But I want to talk more about this kind of work that I did, and this was more focused on what I call the construction of the hearing silences framework. Now, a lot of things are said, especially in my culture, a lot of them are not said. And you have that look, you have that expression, and you can take so much in, but a lot of things are not said. And so I then went back and I looked up and I found some literature on silence, and particularly some literature on agents. I'm going to come to the silence later on. But for example, Sabah Mahmood in her work talks about this particular modality of agency. So this is the kind of an agency is the capacity of somebody to act, right? But in a liberal feminist kind of idea, that would be, acting, being radical, being out on the streets, which is sometimes not a choice for a lot of people, a lot of women living in different contexts. So Sabah Mahmood talks about, and she draws her data from the revolution in Egypt. That's where she did her research. She said this is a particular kind of agency that is created especially by contexts which have historic, in which people live in historically subordinate relations of subordination. So it's a different kind of context where you have been living in these structures historically, which means that perhaps being loud, coming out is structurally a little bit difficult. But what happens in these circumstances, and there is no question on the people who are able to do that, of course, they are needed to simultaneously work on these issues. But what happens is that people develop this particular kind of agency through which people act in these spaces. So the main point is to humanize people who exist within these conditions and structures, right? So I worked a lot around the concept of aspirations. So, but how do you practically, learn about this? How do you practically ask somebody or understand, how this agency is working? So the construct of aspiration was really, really helpful for me, because if you ask people about their aspirations, it's not confined to an aim, ambition, a specific goal. It doesn't need to be realistic. It could be just a dream, but it really helps you tap into that temporal trajectory of a person, what they wanted to do, how did that happen or not happen, what do they want to do in the future. So all of these stories, and if you use it with oral histories, gives you a very rich picture. So what I did with that was, and there was more literature, by Jane Parpart and Swati Prashar, other scholars as well, that talks about the deconstruction of the silence as violence binary. So they talk about how silence is paradoxical in certain cases. For example, silent vigils. For example, silence being used in other ways. And in this context, when voice is usually not an option, then sometimes silence may mean certain different things. So what I did in my work is I conceptualized silence more metaphorically to say a person's refusal to engage in verbal or physical or aspirational kind of activities. And this is what I call disengaging with the world, from the world, right? And then voice was the opposite, re-engaging with the world. So basically, over a lifespan, if you wanted to know what a person is doing, you would ask about their aspirations and analyze when do they disengage and re-engage, and where does that lead them? Now, it could actually mean that somebody wanted to put her child into school and they never ended up staying there, but you would not miss out that opportunity of understanding that journey. And it's a lot about not just the outcome, but also what happens during that journey. Social change is, usually it's a slow process, and there's lots happening before a revolution even happens. So this is by no means, and I've addressed the importance of voice and noise as well, but saying that the world is different, and it could be that certain people are doing things that we can make sense of in different ways. So for me, Southern epistemologies and methodologies are the deconstruction of the frameworks that we already have where we are situated. So for example, in definitely, universities like Oxford and Cambridge. So this led me, this is not just a book project, this is actually the development of an idea and conceptualization of that in-between. So the silence, voice, but actually the in-between space. And if you think about it, a lot of us do navigate this space, where we do things, we say things, we do not say things, we use silence in certain ways and voice in certain other ways. But it becomes essentially important when we're dealing with people who we consider as the South or who are being marginalized. So that thinking of in-betweenness led us to develop this book, which hopefully will come out by the end of this year. So we've got the first manuscript. But if you look at some of the titles, these are amazing and fascinating work. These authors come from all the continents, and they're focusing on, Yazidi women's agency during ISIS, the Gurkundi atrocities in Zimbabwe. We've got, the burqa trope, the Afghan woman. We've got queering silence. So very wonderful kind of titles. But what these scholars are trying to do is they're trying to understand how is that, for example, for male survivors of wartime sexual violence, these communities are silenced. But within those silences that are imposed on them, how do they deal with those, with their voice as well? So that kind of interaction between the silence and voice, where oppression and, kind of gaining some agency actually happens, is something that we're trying to get to. And we're trying to theorize these ideas as a team. So I've got team members. I wonder whether, Jane Parpart and Georgina Holmes. So with that, then also comes my, I would like to mention my research work, which I did in England as well. So I focused mostly on families and communities that have a Pakistani or Bangladeshi heritage. Pakistani because I am Pakistani, Bangladeshi because I would always have a researcher with me who would have, background, would be from the community, would be able to communicate with people in Bengali. So just to say that I am quite conscious in sort of doing research that I don't feel that I have deeper background in. But so the first project was a very interesting one. So we did research with young people, so GCSE age 7 to sort of 11. And so I interviewed these children or young people while they were in the third national lockdown in England. So they come from different cities of England. And it was a fascinating experience because what was happening was that these children had been, or these young people had been in the lockdown situation for the third time. So they were in that captivity, but at the same time, they were used to that sort of environment. And they were learning and reflecting on things that were perhaps not the same as they would when they were anxious the first time around. So it was a very interesting time altogether. And what we saw happening, I love this frog, by the way, what best describes me. So they sent us pictures about the way that they saw themselves. So we've got a paper on that from which talks about the perspectives of parents, and we saw that they were really interesting strategies that parents were actually using for their children to be able to deal with that situation. So feeling of positivity, feeling an environment of coming together, talking more, communicating more, a lot of things like that. And then we've got another paper which is under review, which talks about the perspectives of these young people, and which is actually really, something that I'm excited about. The children turned out to be, so this was the third time that they were in this situation. So they had somehow, and they had gone through that trouble of, GCSE marks, this and that, internal evaluations, no longer being able to, go into STEM because of the marks and the inequalities there. And they had somehow made peace, and they had turned their perspective around from future thinking to living in today and living in the moment. And every single thing that they did, they sought kind of, they sought comfort in thinking about, one after the other. So it's a very interesting concept of, rather than looking at the future, because obviously there was no surety, and it was making them more anxious. So they were enjoying and creating opportunities in the today. So they were very interesting things. And the kind of things that they said were really, you would feel as if they had had the time to process all of these things so deeply. And it was a whole change in perspective, in a sense. And we try to talk about, some of the experiences of people, for example, after war, where people talk about, the prison is in your head. So you get stuck in that environment, and how do you break free and come out of that? But that is one of the papers that I'm really very excited about. The second one, this one was funded by the British Academy. And here we wanted to talk about bridging the local and the global. So we wanted to, local, if you wanted to call it marginalized, or the South, or less heard voices, marginalization of voices as well. So there was a education component. And in this, we interviewed some mothers and their experience of educating their primary school children during COVID. And there's a policy brief that's accepted and will come out. And there's a paper that my wonderful colleague, Lavinia, who's a DPhil here, is the main researcher for. So what we are trying to understand is, they were, as you can see in the collage, so the child is studying and has his feet in the bucket with warm water. So the mothers were actually trying to make learning more relatable for the children. What they were doing was, they were very cleverly picking and choosing what they studied, how they studied that, what was the environment around them at the time when they were studying, how could they relate their learning with what was happening around them, because they couldn't make sense of what was happening around them, right? So we are trying to argue, if we took education to be a very practical field, and if it was very much, connected to the praxis, then why is it that mothers who are most, present there trying to adapt these practices, why can't we treat them as perhaps theorists? And we're trying to, draw on some of the work by Richard Pring and Bell Hooks, who talk about, how that practice and, theory should come together in education. But that's a very interesting one, and we've identified certain, kind of things that they are doing, theories about education based on which they did certain things. Now, there are a couple of projects that are collaborations with partners in Pakistan. I'm sorry, I haven't read out the names of the team members, but I'm sure they're visible here. So one of the project Catherine is also a part of, the first one. So it's It's a collaboration with Durbin, which is a nonprofit teacher education organization. They've partnered with government colleges of education. And what they're trying to do is, this is the first pilot. They're developing an MSc program of teachers, educators, and colleagues from Oxford are, kind of supporting this. And there's a lot of collaboration happening. And the idea is that will be scaled out to other colleges in Pakistan. So actually, we are off to Pakistan tomorrow, Ian, myself, and Anne, for this conference. This is a project that recently we went to do field work for. And this is something that is actually very much close to my heart because of all the issues and the internal displacement in Pakistan because of the recent floods. So the idea was to try and understand gendered inequalities in education during COVID. But when the floods happened, we changed the sort of direction to, and we actually went to communities that were affected by the floods. Just because I want to give an idea of where we were when we conducted research, just an idea of Pakistan, the different colored regions are the provinces. I belong to the yellow one, which borders Afghanistan. We have India on one side, Iran there. So when the Arabian Sea warmed up, we received the monsoon rains were much heavier than we would expect. So Pakistan received 10 times the amount of rains that they would receive more generally. And what that meant was, it's really interesting because we did our work here and there. Now, if you see this is the Indus River. So this is the Indus River civilization. And on this side, we've got these Suleiman ranges, about 6,000 feet tall. Now, when the rain started falling, and it rained nonstop for 40 days, it would fall on the mountain and it would it would flow down, washing away all the houses and everything. On the other side, the Indus River started flooding. So the way that the people described the situation is, they said, there was water beneath us, water coming down from the sky, and we just didn't know what to do. No food, nothing. By the time they had support. What's worse is, in the water came snakes. So the people who actually were able to go on mounds and try to kind of live there, the children were really scared. A lot of them got bitten by the snakes as well. So very difficult situation for Pakistan. A lot of them are still internally displaced. And just a bit of a glimpse. So, here you have a metal chest kind of thing. We call it a trunk, and people would put their valuables in this. So that is a whole village that was destroyed. And it was schools, as you can see, buildings were really, really destroyed, some temporary arrangements there. But yeah, so I just want to talk a little bit about the methodology that we are so worried about, and the research design. So we went in thinking that we'd do interviews, but eventually we ended up doing lots of discussions. So we would go first to the village kind of community. There we would have some kind of political leaders and all the elders of the village, plus all the men. We would sit down and we would have a conversation with them. They would talk to us about their issues. So we've got community meetings like that. And then we would go, and that's another one. And then we would go and meet the women separately. Sometimes we would get to speak with some women, separately or within the group. And then we also got to speak with some of the professionals. For example, that is, so this is Mr. Rashid. He is the headmaster of one of the boys' schools. So the whole village didn't have any girls' school. And he was the one who took a stand, and he was actually admitting girls in this school, which is quite interesting because otherwise they wouldn't have any place to go to. So he had a good population of girls that were studying there, and we got to speak with them, teachers. Then we also spoke with one of the members of Provincial Assembly. Then we spoke with one social worker and one MBBS doctor who was working in one of the basic health units. So we haven't analyzed the data, but I think as a researcher who works on these issues, it is imperative that we work on policy briefs first. So get everything out that we have at the moment, the information that we have, disseminate that within the policy circles in Pakistan, and then also publish that. And I think that is also one of the responsibilities I feel as a researcher when you do research in these areas, to get that stuff out as soon as you can. And so some issues that I won't go deeper into, but we intend to kind of write about that. I just want to actually conclude. I won't take more of time, but I just wanted to talk about my teaching that is also informed by the research that I do. So when I joined the department, I was quite pleased because I was given a list of modules that I could teach. And then I said, I have another one in mind. Can I design that? And to my delight, they said yes. And so I started working on that. There was a new freedom. Then I was anxious and I was really panicked. I put myself in this. But this module actually is something that I'm very much, I really feel deeply about. So what we do in the module, it has 3 themes. The first theme is that we talk about, and we delve into all kinds of literature that tells us about the field per se. When you enter a field and the field looks very different, you could end up being in a whistling community, for example. We analyze that as one of the cases to try and make sense of how do you communicate? What do you take from this field? How do you make sense of it? So what happens in the field, that is something that we explore. Then we explore the self-reflexivity of the researcher, how you think about yourself, how you become aware of your own positionality. These are some things that a lot of research modules actually teach. But we also delve into then this aspect of dissemination. So thinking deeply about when we disseminate, when we give to the world what we've learned, how does that feed into different discourses? What is the picture that is painted after the work that we do and give out to the world? So a lot of sensitization around, how is it that we try and be as aware as we can about the discourses that are already out there about certain communities and the complexities between that too. And the third part is obviously is a seminar where researchers who've recently been through these situations and they've really been torn in those ethical dilemmas come and present their work. And then the students have their presentations and in which they can be quite creative. I mean, people have done poems and different things in the past. But this is something that constantly, feeds into the research that I do. And I learn a lot when I sit with different students and when we talk and we discuss these things and we try to apply these things to the projects that we are doing. There's a lot of learning that happens for me in these as well. So just 2 projects that I have in mind. One of them is the student, family, teacher knowledge exchange, some kind of a structure that sustains itself in the knowledge that feeds within this kind of triad. And this I'm hoping to be in the context of England and prospective funder. I've got a small proposal, still need to flesh out the details of this, probably is going to be SRC or any other. The other one is aspirational possibilities of the youth in Hunza, Pakistan. So that is probably going to be presented to the Aliya Khalid Foundation. They've done a lot of work in Hunza. And I'd like to follow the trajectories and see, what the journeys have been. But yeah, thank you so much. That is the kind of work that I do.